In a dusty livestock auction yard in Cedar Hollow, Oregon, where broken things are sold by the pound, and hope rarely lingers, a young firefighter with tired eyes raised his hand and changed 2 lives forever. The dog had no name, no trust, no future. They called him worthless. But Jack Renshaw didn't see a broken animal. He saw a soul like his own, scarred, but not beyond saving. What happened next would not only heal a wounded golden retriever, it would start a movement that reached far beyond one small town. If this story moves your heart like it moved ours, stay with us. This is the story of Sunny. Cedar Hollow, Oregon, woke beneath a quilt of fog that October morning. The small town sat nestled in the foothills of the Cascades, where pine trees clung to the mountains like old secrets, and the wind carried the sharp scent of cedar and ash. It had rained the night before, and now the morning chill clung to everything. Puddles shimmered in cracked pavement, and mist curled around the tires of trucks parked outside the old livestock auction barn, a squat, weather-beaten structure that looked as though it might crumble into the soil if the mountain wind pushed too hard. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed above the dirt floor, throwing pale light onto steel gates and rusting feed bins. The crowd that gathered that day was thin, mostly older ranchers, rough men with calloused hands and wind-burned faces, their flannel shirts tucked into worn jeans, boots still caked with last season's mud. It wasn't the kind of place one visited with dreams. Here, the items for sale were unwanted: balky goats, injured ponies, discarded equipment, and occasionally dogs. Curled up in the corner of a cold steel cage was a golden retriever, roughly 6 years old, with a sun-faded coat that had once been a rich, brilliant gold, but now looked more like damp straw. He was lean to the point of skeletal ribs, visible hips, bony and patches of fur missing along his back legs. A jagged scar trailed down his right side, hidden partially by what little fur remained there. His tail didn't wag. His eyes didn't lift. He was still like a statue carved from suffering. There was no collar and no microchip, no name. The auction staff had written, no tag on his paperwork, Carl Bishop. The auctioneer was a heavyset man in his 60s whose voice had long lost its enthusiasm. His gray hair stuck out from beneath a sweat-stained trucker cap, and his red suspenders strained across his round belly as he shuffled to the microphone. Next up, he said, a voice scratchy from years of cigarette smoke and disinterest. Male, golden retriever, adult. No records, no tags. Starting bid at $5. A few chuckles rippled through the scattered onlookers. Looks like he's on his last leg, someone muttered near the hay bales. Another called out, I'll give you 10 if you throw in a shovel to bury him. Carl didn't laugh. Even he winced. The dog didn't move. He hadn't moved since morning. He'd refused food, water, even eye contact. A volunteer had tried to pet him the day before, and ended up with a torn sleeve and a warning look. No tag wasn't aggressive. Just done. From the back of the room a figure stood. Jack Renshaw was 34 tall and broad-shouldered, with a quiet intensity about him that made people keep their voices low when he entered a room. His hair, once jet black, now bore streaks of early gray at the temples. His face was handsome, but hollowed, the kind of face that smiled with effort. He wore a faded Cedar Hollow Volunteer Fire Department jacket over a dark green Henley, and his boots were scuffed, still dusted with ash from a barn fire 2 weeks ago. His right hand bore a pale scar that wrapped around the wrist, evidence of a day he never talked about. A year ago, he had led a failed rescue operation during a house fire on Pine Hollow Road. 3 lives were lost. One of them was a boy. Since then, Jack had spoken less and slept even less. He hadn't planned to be at the auction that day. He had been driving aimlessly, lost in thought, when the sign caught his eye. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was fate. But when he saw the dog, something in him stirred. Something long buried, I'll take him. Jack said quietly. The laughter stopped. Carl looked up surprised. You sure? Jack nodded. I said, I'll take him. Carl shrugged and banged the gavel. Sold $5. He handed Jack a leash, cracked leather with a rusted clip, and a flimsy adoption form. No questions asked, Jack approached the cage slowly. The dog lifted his eyes for the first time and met Jack's gaze. Not with trust, not with fear, just recognition. A quiet, shattered understanding passed between them like a whisper. It took nearly an hour to coax No-Tag into Jack's truck. Jack didn't use the leash. He didn't force. He just sat outside the cage talking gently about nothing, about cedar trees and creeks, about storms and silence. Eventually, the dog stood slowly, stiffly, and followed. As they pulled away from the auction house, the fog had begun to lift, revealing slivers of pale blue sky between the trees. The drive back into town was quiet. The dog lay curled on the passenger seat but didn't sleep. Jack didn't speak. It was enough that they weren't alone. Jack's house sat on the edge of Cedar Hollow, a modest two-bedroom cabin with white siding and green shutters inherited from his grandfather. It was surrounded by a wide fenced yard and backed by a slope of thick pine forest. The barn was old but sturdy, the porch deep and wide. Jack parked the truck, opened the door, and waited. The dog didn't move. Jack didn't coax. He stepped onto the gravel driveway and headed toward the porch. A minute later, the sound of cautious paws followed. Across the street, inside a blue cottage with wildflowers painted along the fence, and a mailbox shaped like a cat, a girl watched from behind a lace curtain. Maggie Lewis was 9 years old, small and wiry, with a quiet face and wide blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore mismatched socks, oversized glasses, and often carried a sketchbook instead of a backpack. Maggie had been diagnosed with high-functioning autism at age 4. She didn't like loud noises or sudden changes. Dogs terrified her. Their bark, their unpredictability, their closeness. But she loved patterns, symmetry, and quiet. Her mother, Hannah Lewis, a single mom and part-time art teacher, had long since stopped forcing Maggie into the world. Instead, she brought the world to Maggie through art, through stories, through quiet afternoons in the garden. Hannah was in her mid-30s, slender, with tired green eyes and long brown hair she always wore, tied up in a pencil bun. She had a gentle voice and carried a sadness she rarely spoke of. Maggie's father, a military medic, had passed when Maggie was 2. That morning, Maggie had wandered to the window, sketchbook in hand, ready to draw the rain-slicked yard. But when she saw the golden retriever step cautiously from the truck, her hands paused. She didn't speak. She didn't scream. She didn't name him. She just watched Jack reach the porch and turned. The dog had followed, standing at the foot of the steps, ears back-tail, low. Jack crouched and opened the screen door. "You don't have to come in," he said quietly, "but the porch is dry." The dog stepped forward slowly and sat not next to Jack, but near close enough to matter. And so, on a damp October morning in Cedar Hollow, Oregon, a broken man and a nameless dog took the first step into something neither could yet understand. Cedar Hollow settled into a gray stillness in the days following the auction. The morning fog lingered longer now, curling like ghosts around the old fence posts and pine trunks on Jack Renshaw's property. The air had a bite to it. October was sliding toward winter. Jack's small farmstead, set against a slope of dense Oregon forest, looked peaceful from the road, but within its quiet corners tension still hung like mist over the field. The dog, still officially nameless, had spent his first night lying curled up in the far corner of the porch beneath the faded rocking chair Jack's grandfather used to sit in. He hadn't touched the bowl of food Jack had placed near the step. He hadn't moved much at all. Jack had slept on the couch inside, leaving the front door cracked just enough that the dog could come in if he chose. He hadn't. In the pale light of dawn, Jack stepped out with a mug of black coffee and sat on the top step. He wore flannel-lined work pants and a thick olive-green thermal shirt. His hair was still damp from a quick shower, and his breath steamed in the cold. The dog lifted his head ever so slightly, ears twitching at the sound of boots on wood, then lowered it again. No growl, no wag, just awareness. This was how the days passed. The golden retriever was a shell of what his breed promised. No joyful energy, no bounding enthusiasm. He moved stiffly, a hint of an old limp visible when he did walk. And his coat, though thickening now that he was out of the rain, remained patchy in spots. His eyes were pale amber, and there was something aged in them, something that had seen too much. His ribs were still sharply visible under the curve of his sides, and his tail remained low, never wagging. Jack gave him space but not absence. He never forced touch. He spoke gently often about things that didn't matter, whether firewood, the morning's chores. He placed food and water within sight but never too close. He let the dog exist without pressure, and in return the dog stayed. That was all Jack could ask for. 3 days passed before the dog accepted food directly from Jack's hand. It happened in silence under a sky spitting light rain while they sat together beneath the porch awning. Jack had torn off a corner of his sandwich turkey, dry no mayo, and placed it in his palm. The dog hesitated, then stepped forward ever so slowly, and took it with the softest touch of teeth. Jack let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was on that same afternoon that Jack gave him a name. "Sonny," he said aloud, almost testing the weight of it. The dog looked at him but gave no reaction. "You're not there yet," Jack added with a small rueful smile. "But maybe one day." Across the street from the second-story window of the blue cottage with the cat-shaped mailbox, Maggie Lewis had been watching the slow ballet unfold. She watched everything. The girl was 9 years old, quiet as breath, with a curtain of golden hair and pale skin that almost glowed in the afternoon light. Her world was filtered through a lens most didn't understand. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at the age of 4, Maggie had withdrawn from most social contact. She didn't like noise or crowds. She didn't respond to small talk or pretend games. But she did draw. Always her sketchbooks filled rapidly. Hundreds of pages, bound and unbound, filled with trees, fences, birds, windows, clouds. But in the last few days something new had begun to appear. A shape, a large, soft creature with folded ears and watchful eyes now surfaced in the corners of her drawings. At first it had no detail. Just the outline of something golden, low to the ground, watching. Hannah Lewis noticed Hannah was a slender woman in her mid-30s, always dressed in earth tones and soft fabrics with long brown hair, often tied into a loose braid. She had once dreamed of being a painter, but after becoming a single mother, she'd turned to teaching elementary school art and giving private lessons from home. Warm and perceptive, Hannah had grown to understand Maggie's world in layers through color-shape rhythm. She didn't force conversation but listened to silence. That afternoon, while Maggie sat cross-legged on the window seat, scribbling with a soft charcoal pencil, Hannah approached with a tray of apple slices and cheese. "Is that Jack's dog again?" she asked, voice light. Maggie didn't respond, but her pencil pressed deeper. "You've been drawing him a lot," Hannah continued, setting the plate nearby. "What do you think he's feeling today?" Maggie paused, then, without looking up, whispered a single word. "Alone." It was the first word she had spoken aloud in nearly a week. Hannah blinked, surprised, but careful not to show it. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think so too." Back at the farm, Jack sat cross-legged near the edge of the porch, as Sonny, his name now spoken daily, whether or not the dog acknowledged it lay curled at a distance. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained thick overhead, casting the world in silver gray. Jack ran a hand through his hair, now disheveled and damp. He'd started talking more to the dog mostly, but in a way that felt like talking to himself. When I was in the department, he said one night, his voice quiet, "There was this one house fire up on Pine Hollow. We were 2 minutes late, that's all." 2 minutes. You think 2 minutes can't change a life, but they can. They did. The dog lifted his head at the sound of emotion in Jack's voice. I still hear the mother's voice. Every night, silence stretched between them like a wound, open but not festering. "I think, you know what that's like," Jack added, "carrying something you didn't ask for." Sonny didn't move, but he didn't look away either. That was progress. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky with streaks of diluted gold, Maggie stepped outside her house. She carried her sketchpad clutched to her chest like a shield. She didn't cross the street. She didn't call out. She just sat on the steps of her porch and opened the book, page after page filled with the golden figure, distant at first but gradually closer in each drawing, and on the final page a soft charcoal outline of a dog lying beside a man under a starlit sky. Above it in pencil, one word, written in delicate cursive Sonny. The rain had returned to Cedar Hollow, Oregon, a steady whispering drizzle that painted the town in shades of ash and silver. Jack Renshaw's small farm, nestled at the foot of a pine-covered hill, seemed even quieter beneath the cloud-heavy sky. Drops tapped softly on the porch roof, ran down the windows in crooked trails, and collected in puddles near the fence line. It was the kind of weather that made old scars ache, physical and otherwise. Inside the barn, Jack crouched beside a pile of chopped wood, his gloved hands dusty from moving crates. The barn smelled of sawdust and faint smoke. Memories clung to everything here. He was cleaning out a forgotten corner, a task he'd avoided for months. His old fire department gear had been stashed there since the incident on Pine Hollow Road, a blackened helmet, a warped oxygen mask, and his turnout jacket still stiff with soot. Jack pulled it out with a grimace and paused. At the sound of shifting straw, he turned the golden retriever. Sonny, as he'd begun to respond to, stood in the doorway, damp and cautious. His coat was slowly thickening again, the gold returning in uneven patches. His walk still had that stiff limp in the back right leg, and he never moved quickly as though speed might trigger something he didn't want to remember. His eyes, though brighter than before, still held a haunting echo of silence. Jack gave a small nod, not moving closer. "You get bored of the porch." Sonny stood still for a moment, then padded forward slowly, deliberately, until he was a few feet away. His ears were up, tail low, but no longer tucked. Jack reached toward a small crate for the bag of treats and tossed one gently across the floor. Sonny sniffed it, then ate. "You're getting better," Jack murmured. "Still not talking much, though." "That's okay, I'm not great at that either." As Jack turned back to his jacket, his fingers brushed against something cold beneath the collar, small metallic and wedged deep in the padding. He frowned, peeled back a seam with careful fingers, and pulled out a tiny corroded metal tag nearly swallowed by time and grime. The edges were bent and the engraving was worn, but he could still make out the letters and numbers. Sergeant K412. Jack's heart slowed. Well, I'll be damned. He turned it over in his hand, studying it in the dim barn light. The tag wasn't standard ID. It was a military classification tag, the kind issued to dogs in federal service. He walked to the workbench and gently cleaned the grime away with a shop rag. Below, the serial number barely visible, were the words, "Fire Unit, Response Dog." Jack looked over at Sonny, who had settled into a cautious sit near the hay. "You weren't just a pet, were you?" His voice softened. "You were trained." Sonny didn't move, but his ears rotated slightly. He was listening. Jack leaned on the bench, thinking he'd heard rumors during his firefighting days about federal programs that trained dogs for fire response search and rescue canines used to navigate collapsed structures, sniff out trapped victims, even carry small oxygen masks. Most of those programs had been cut after budget reviews labeled as ineffective or too specialized. Did they drop you because you were injured? Jack wondered aloud. Or did something worse happen? Sonny lowered his head, body still but tense. A tremble moved through his shoulders. Jack didn't press. He simply folded the tag in a cloth and placed it inside his jacket pocket. Well, Sergeant K412, welcome home. Welcome. Across the road, the blue cottage sat wrapped in soft light. Inside, Maggie Lewis was seated on the floor of the living room, surrounded by colored pencils, sketchbooks, and a half-finished painting of pine trees under starlight. She was hunched over her latest page, lips slightly parted in concentration, tongue pressed to one corner of her mouth, a habit she had when she was deep in her world. Hannah Lewis. Her mother was nearby at the kitchen counter dicing vegetables for soup. Tall and lithe, with tired green eyes, and a habit of humming old jazz tunes while cooking. Hannah glanced toward Maggie every so often. Her daughter had spoken more in the last 2 weeks than in the previous 2 months. Small words, mostly an observation, but words nonetheless. This afternoon something had shifted. Maggie had stood up without prompting, slid her shoes on, and walked to the front door with her sketchpad in hand. Hannah blinked. "Where are you going, sweetheart?" Maggie pointed across the street. "Outside," she said, barely above a whisper. Her voice was clear but cautious, like someone learning how to speak again. Hannah hesitated, wiping her hands on a towel. "You want me to come with you?" Maggie shook her head. "Just me." The rain had thinned to a drizzle by the time Maggie stepped off her porch. She wore a bright yellow raincoat that billowed around her thin frame, and her long hair was tied in a lopsided ponytail. She clutched the sketchbook to her chest like armor as she crossed the quiet street, one careful step at a time, her boots splashing softly in the shallow puddles. Sonny was lying under the porch overhang again, his head resting on his paws, eyes watching the road. Jack was sitting on the porch steps with a mug in hand when he spotted the girl. He stood slowly, unsure of what to say. "Maggie, right?" he asked gently, nodding toward her. She didn't respond. Her eyes were on the dog. Jack took a cautious step back, giving her space. "He's gentle, just shy. Like some people I know." Maggie stopped at the base of the steps. Her hand trembled slightly as she held her sketchpad tighter. Sonny lifted his head. The two stared at each other for a moment that stretched thin in the soft rain. Then, without a word, Maggie knelt slowly in the wet grass. She opened her sketchbook, flipped to a page, and turned it toward Sonny. It was a charcoal drawing, rough but recognizable, a dog with soft eyes curled on a wooden porch. Sonny didn't move. Maggie, her face serious but not afraid, extended her small hand palm down toward the dog. There was no sound but the falling rain and the distant hush of wind in the trees. Sonny looked at the hand. Then, inch by inch, he pushed himself forward. He sniffed, and then gently, slowly, pressed his nose against her palm. Cedar Hollow's skies had shifted overnight. The early morning air, usually cool and damp with mist, had turned sharp and dry, tinged with the faint acrid scent of smoke. At the edge of town, near the ridge known as Hollow's Crest, a crackling wind carried whispers of danger. The forest surrounding the town was dense and dry, and after weeks without significant rainfall it had become a tinderbox waiting for a spark. At the small farm, tucked beneath those hills, Jack Renshaw stepped onto the porch with a thermos of coffee in one hand, the other resting loosely on the worn rail. He wore a faded gray hoodie and jeans tucked into work boots, his eyes scanning the horizon. A dull orange glow shimmered faintly in the sky to the northwest. unnatural and shifting. His firefighter instincts stirred immediately. That wasn't morning light. That was fire. Jack turned and whistled sharply. The dog beside him stirred. Sonny had changed in the weeks since Jack brought him home. Once skeletal and detached, the golden retriever had begun to regain his strength. His coat was richer now, a darker gold in some places, his walk still careful but more assured. He was still cautious, still haunted, but something had begun to return. A glimmer of purpose, perhaps, or memory. Jack knelt beside him. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Sonny's ears twitched. His body tensed. At that moment, a siren blared in the distance, one of the old emergency towers that still functioned on the edge of Cedar Hollow. Jack stood quickly pulling his fire radio from the porch bench, static. Then a voice. Hollow's crest, multiple spot fires. Possible campers trapped near ledge trail. Response teams assembling at the West Station. Jack's jaw tightened. The West Station was 30 minutes away. The fire could spread in 10. Before he could move, Sonny let out a sharp bark, his first real vocalization since the day they met. Then he was off the porch and running toward the tree line. "Sonny," Jack called, startled. "Wait." But Sonny didn't wait. Jack grabbed his jacket radio and emergency med pack before sprinting after the dog. He wasn't entirely sure why, only that Sonny was running with intent, not fear. Through the underbrush they went, ducking branches, dodging fallen logs, the scent of smoke growing thicker with every step. The forest darkened as they approached the ridge, ash beginning to drift like slow-motion snow. Jack caught up near the ridge's edge, heart pounding, lungs burning. Sonny had stopped, ears erect, body stiff. Beyond the ridge, a slope descended into a shallow glen, and there, through the smoke, Jack saw a flickering orange wall creeping toward a clearing. In that clearing, barely visible through the haze, were 3 figures, a man and 2 children, no older than 10, huddled beside a canvas tent. The man's leg was pinned beneath a fallen log. "Jesus," Jack muttered, dropping to his knees beside Sonny. "How the hell did you know?" Sonny looked at him once briefly, then darted down the slope Jack followed. The rescue unfolded in adrenaline-timed flashes. Jack reached the campers quickly, his voice calm despite the fear rising in his chest. The man, early 40s, wearing cargo shorts and a flannel shirt, was pale with shock. His leg clearly broken. His name was Ted Chambers, a local school science teacher who had taken his niece and nephew on a weekend hike. They'd gotten turned around and made camp too close to the slope. The fire had caught them by surprise. "I can't move." Ted gasped. "The kids, please, just get them out first." Jack nodded. "Sonny," he called. The dog appeared beside him, panting, eyes sharp. Jack motioned toward the children who were frozen in terror. "Go to them." Gently, Sonny approached slowly, belly low, ears soft. The children, frightened at first, watched as the dog nudged them gently, guiding them toward the safe side of the clearing. Jack turned back to Ted, pulling a small crowbar from his med pack. "This'll hurt," he said. Together, they got the log off. Jack secured Ted's leg with cloth strips, helping him limp down the slope. Smoke was getting thicker now. Sparks floated through the trees. When they reached the safer clearing below, the children were already there, holding Sonny tightly, tears streaming down their ash-smudged faces. By the time emergency crews arrived, Jack and Sonny had led the group halfway back to town, navigating terrain. Jack didn't even remember consciously choosing. It was as if Sonny had known the safest route. Ted was airlifted. The children were taken to the clinic for smoke inhalation. Jack, covered in soot, knelt beside Sonny in the station parking lot, brushing ash from his fur. "You knew," Jack said quietly. "You knew before I did." Sonny lay still, head resting on Jack's boot. "You're not just a rescue case." Jack continued. You were a rescuer. Across town in a warm living room, lit only by the blue glow of a TV screen, Maggie Lewis sat on the floor legs tucked beneath her eyes wide. The local station was airing breaking footage, a dog leading two children out of the forest, their faces buried in his fur. The caption read, Unknown. Golden Retriever. Assists. Firefighter in heroic rescue. Maggie didn't blink. Her sketchpad had slipped from her lap forgotten. As the video played again, she leaned forward, one hand reaching out as if to touch the screen. Her lips parted. She whispered, Sonny. Then, for the first time in months, Maggie began to cry, not from fear, not from sensory overload, but from something else. Something deeper. She didn't hide her face. She didn't try to stop the tears. Hannah, standing silently in the doorway, brought a hand to her mouth. Her daughter was feeling and showing it. The fire had passed, but its scent lingered in Cedar Hollow like a ghost that refused to leave smoke no longer curled over the ridgelines, yet everything still tasted faintly of ash. The town, used to its quiet rhythm of rain and pine, had been rattled by the event, but now it settled into that familiar Oregon stillness overcast mornings, heavy skies, and the occasional sunbeam slipping like grace between clouds. On the porch of a white farmhouse just off Quarry Hill Road, Sonny lay beneath the bench, swing resting his head on his paws. His left flank was shaved where a patch of singed fur had been treated, and faint pink skin showed through the golden coat that was beginning to regrow. He was healing slowly, but the weariness in his eyes was no longer fear. It was something gentler. Endurance. Jack Renshaw sat beside him, one boot planted on the step, the other stretched forward. He wore his usual jeans and fire department hoodie, but there was less tension in his shoulders now. He sipped coffee from a chipped green mug, watching Sonny breathe. You did good, you know. Jack said. Sonny's tail gave a small thump. People are starting to talk. Some reporter wants to do a segment on you. He smiled slightly at the dog's reaction. None? Sonny didn't care about cameras. He cared about silence, about trust. Jack reached down and gently scratched behind one ear. They're calling you the Ghost of the Ridge. Like some legend. Sonny blinked slowly, head still on his paws. Word had spread quickly through the town. The story of a scarred, nameless golden retriever who led two children to safety in the fire had caught fire of its own. Jack had been interviewed by the local station. The footage of Sonny emerging from the smoke with a child under each arm had been shared online, racking up views, and within a week strangers were dropping off dog food and handwritten notes at Jack's gate. Someone even sent a handmade collar stitched with the name Sonny in gold thread. Jack didn't like attention, but he understood it was for Sonny. The doorbell rang, late that afternoon. Jack stepped off the porch and opened the weathered screen door. Standing there was a tall man in his 60s with a strong build, a weather-beaten face and sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His gray hair was buzzed military short, and his posture, straight-backed and solid, spoke of years in service. He wore an old fire and rescue jacket from a different county and carried a satchel slung over one shoulder. Jack Renshaw, the man asked, voice gravelly but warm. Jack nodded. That's me. I'm Thomas Grady, retired captain, Clark County, Fire K-9 Division. Jack blinked, surprised. You came a long way. I heard about the dog. Grady said simply, and when I saw his photo, I recognized him. Jack opened the door wider and stepped aside. You'd better come in. Thomas Grady took a seat in the living room, removing his jacket and setting the satchel at his feet. The room smelled faintly of coffee and pine wood, the fireplace crackling behind them. Sonny stood in the corner, watching the man. That's him, Grady said softly, leaning forward. There's no doubt that dog's name was Valor. Sergeant K-412. I trained him. Jack looked from the dog to Grady. He has a tag. Found it in one of my old jackets. He must have tucked it under there the first night. Grady nodded slowly. He was one of the best search and rescue fire division trained to find people in collapsed structures, burned homes, hypersensitive to smoke, even small temperature changes. Smart, brave. His eyes drifted to Sonny. He saved a lot of lives. What happened? Jack asked. How does a dog like that end up dumped at an auction? Grady's jaw tightened. There was an incident, one they tried to bury. An explosion at a training site. He disobeyed protocol and ran into a building that hadn't been cleared. Saved a firefighter who'd been miscounted. But because he didn't wait for orders, they flagged him. Said he was unstable, dangerous. The program was being cut anyway. Budget issues, so they classified him as unadoptable and scheduled him for destruction. Jack stared. He saved someone and got punished for it. Grady nodded. Happens more often than you'd think. Sonny had moved closer, still slow, but more direct. He stood now just beside Jack's chair, his body relaxed, tail low. Grady smiled faintly. He remembers. Jack looked down. He's not perfect. Still gets startled by sirens, freezes up sometimes. But he's come back to life here. Grady pulled a file from his satchel, handing it to Jack. I kept everything, training logs, commendations, even photos. I thought someone should know who he really was. Jack took the folder, flipping through pages of neat reports. Images of Sonny Valor in full rescue gear standing proud beside rubble. Beside men in uniform. Thank you, Jack said quietly. He's more than just a rescue case now. No, Grady said he always was. Meanwhile, across the street, Hannah Lewis was putting the final touches on the community bulletin board at the local co-op. With the help of her daughter Maggie, they had organized something new. An art exhibit, small but meaningful. The hand-lettered banner read, Sonny's Journey. A child's view of a hero's heart art by Maggie Lewis. Proceeds to benefit retired service dogs in Oregon. The co-op owner, Marla Beck, a stout woman with a big voice and an even bigger heart, had offered the space immediately after hearing Maggie's story. Your kid's got talent, she'd said to Hannah, and that dog's got angels on his side. Inside, the exhibit was modest, 12-framed drawings hung on thin wires along the far wall, each one a snapshot of Sonny's transformation. The first showed him curled and afraid beneath Jack's porch. The last, drawn from memory and imagination, showed him standing tall amid fire and smoke, glowing like a beacon. Maggie didn't say much as they prepared, but she helped hang each frame measured distances with care, and placed a small donation jar beneath the title card. On the lid, she taped a note that read, For the dogs they left behind. Hannah stood quietly, pride and emotion swelling in her chest. Her daughter, so quiet for so long, had found her voice, and she'd used it to speak for someone else. Cedar Hollow woke beneath heavy clouds that morning, the kind that carried more than rain. The air was thick with something electric, unsaid, unseen, but undeniably there. Wind whipped down from the north, tugging at signs and shaking pine branches as if urging the town to brace itself. At Jack Renshaw's farmhouse, the front porch creaked beneath a shifting weight. Sonny lay curled beneath the swing, his tail brushing the wood. He was more golden now, brighter, fuller, but scars still mapped his body beneath the coat. One on his shoulder still puckered slightly. Another near his hip had never grown fur back, but he moved with calm confidence now. His eyes, once hollow, were steady. He was no longer just surviving. He was present inside. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the room dim, save for the soft glow from the old green-shaded lamp over the counter. The file Thomas Grady had brought last week lay open pages fanned out across the table like fallen leaves, training reports, assessment notes, photographs. Beside them, Jack's laptop blinked softly. The deeper he read, the harder his jaw set. He didn't hear the footsteps until a voice spoke from the doorway. You found the redacted one, said Thomas Grady. Grady had returned to Cedar Hollow 2 days earlier, bringing more files unearthed from his personal archive. He wore a brown wool coat, now his military build still unmistakable beneath it, and carried the same satchel heavy with what he called the truth they tried to bury. Not just redacted, Jack muttered, manipulated. These logs say Sonny was erratic, but here he tapped a medical report they sedated him for disobedience. No warning, no debrief, just punishment. Grady stepped into the light, his face drawn with quiet rage. It was standard. Electric collars, isolation, kennels with held food. They didn't want search and rescue dogs, they wanted control. Jack sat back, running a hand through his hair. And this is the same unit that dumped him at an auction like broken equipment. They didn't want him to be found, Grady said grimly. They sat in silence for a while, the wind knocking at the windows. Then Jack leaned forward. We have to expose this. Grady nodded. I've been waiting for someone who'd fight alone. I couldn't, but with you, we gather everything Jack said already. Standing, we take it to the board, the press, hell to the governor if we have to. Grady gave a rare grim smile. They'll push back, then we push harder. Meanwhile, across the street, the little blue cottage buzzed with the quiet activity of a child's plan unfolding. Maggie Lewis, now a few weeks into her silent but expressive awakening, sat at the kitchen table, with a large square of white fabric laid before her. She was focused, eyes narrowed slightly behind her round glasses, her small hands moving slowly, carefully like a painter restoring a masterpiece. The scarf was cotton soft and light, and already dotted with dabs of watercolor. A pine tree, a streak of firelight, a tiny gold paw print. In one corner, Maggie had painted a rising sun, pale yellow outlined with orange. It was quiet work, but deliberate. She paused only once to trace the shape of Sonny's head with her finger. Hannah Lewis stood nearby, watching in silence, one hand loosely holding a mug of tea. The soft light from the window illuminated her daughter's face, calm and focused. "Is that for Sonny?" she asked gently. Maggie nodded without looking up. "Do you want me to help tie it on later?" A beat passed, then Maggie shook her head. "I want to give it to him." Hannah blinked, heart catching in her chest. "Of course," she whispered. That evening, as the wind howled over the hills and the last gold rays of sunlight slipped behind the trees, Jack and Grady returned from town with a thick envelope of legal documents. Grady had found old emails, internal memos, even an anonymous whistleblower letter. "They'll come for us if this gets out," Jack said as they stepped onto the porch. Grady gave a tired sigh. "Let them." As they entered, they didn't see the small figure crossing the road, rain boots tapping softly against pavement. Maggie had waited until the porch lights flickered on. She carried the folded scarf wrapped in wax paper clutched tight in both hands. Her breath fogged in the cold. She didn't tremble. She didn't look back. She reached the gate and opened it slowly. Sonny looked up from the porch, ears twitching. She approached with small, deliberate steps. Jack stepped out again, just in time to see her kneel beside the dog. "Maggie," he called gently, but Maggie didn't answer. She unwrapped the scarf and, with a kind of reverence only a child could summon, reached out. Sonny watched her without flinching. When her hand came near, he stepped forward slightly. She placed the scarf gently around his neck and tied a loose knot beneath his chin. "There," she said. "Just barely." Sonny licked her hand once. Jack stood frozen, the breath catching in his chest. Not because of the moment, but because of what it meant. The girl who never touched the dog, who never trusted, meeting here without fear. That night, after Hannah had come to walk. Maggie home, Sonny didn't return to the porch swing. Instead, As Jack read on the living room floor beside the fireplace, the dog padded over and lay down beside the couch where Maggie had sat earlier. He sniffed the floor, then curled up. When Jack rose an hour later to head upstairs, Sonny stayed. It was the first time he had slept inside without invitation, and the first time he slept near someone else. The rain had returned to Cedar Hollow slow and steady, like the breath of something long held in. On the day of the hearing, the town square buzzed with voices muffled beneath umbrellas and hoods. Clouds pressed low over the mountains, and the courthouse, an old brick building with ivy clawing its sides, stood like a weary sentinel. The world outside was gray, but inside something brighter was stirring. Jack Renshaw stood at the edge of the small chamber-turned public forum, fingers flexing at his sides. He wore his old dress uniform, dark blue, with silver buttons, the crest of the Cedar Hollow Fire Department stitched over his heart. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were calm. Beside him, Sonny sat, posture straight eyes, watchful. The golden retriever wore the scarf Maggie had painted tied proudly around his neck like a badge of memory. Sonny had healed more than anyone had believed possible, not just his body but something deeper. His fur had grown thick again, the old scars now softened by time. His gait, though still bearing the trace of a limp, was strong. And now, as people filed into the gallery, whispering and craning their necks, he remained still present and dignified. On the bench behind Jack sat Thomas Grady, clad in a crisp gray blazer and jeans, his face unreadable but steady. He had been fighting for this moment longer than anyone knew. The chairwoman of the State Ethics Committee, Evelyn Harper, entered with her panel of 3. Evelyn was a woman in her early 60s, elegant but unflinching, with snow-white hair cut in a sharp bob and piercing brown eyes. She had prosecuted corporate scandals and exposed political fraud, but this case, dogs forgotten by systems they once served, had struck something tender in her. "We're here to examine evidence." She began, her voice echoing just enough to silence the room, regarding the training and subsequent abandonment of federal service animals in high-stress response programs. Jack was called to speak first. He stepped forward, heart pounding quietly, and cleared his throat. "My name is Jack Renshaw," he said, "former firefighter, resident of Cedar Hollow. This is Sonny." He gestured toward the dog. Sonny was once designated as Sergeant K. Ford 12 in a specialized federal fire response program. He was trained, decorated, and then discarded. There was no drama in his voice, only weight. He handed a flash drive to the assistant clerk. "Contained on this are reports, some redacted, others recovered by Thomas Grady, showing evidence of abusive training methods used on canines like Sonny electric shocks, withheld food, isolation used as punishment." He paused. Sonny was labeled unfit for service after disobeying a direct command to abandon a collapsed building. He went in anyway, saved a firefighter who had been miscounted, and for that he was punished. Gasps rose in the gallery. Jack turned toward the crowd. "I found him at a livestock auction. Starved, scarred, forgotten." He knelt beside Sonny. The dog placed one paw on his knee. "This," Jack said. His voice cracking as what the system threw away. Sonny looked toward the panel, then quietly stood and walked to the center of the room. Gasps again. A child in the audience whispered, "It's the dog from the fire." Sonny stopped and sat, tall, silent. Golden Jack straightened. The system said he couldn't be trusted, that he was broken. But this town knows the truth. He saved lives. He still does. The room fell silent. Then, from the side of the courtroom, a soft rustling. Maggie Lewis stepped forward. She wore a pale blue dress, her blonde hair tied back in a loose ribbon. In one hand, she held a folded sheet of paper, crinkled at the edges. Her mother, Hannah, sat nearby, tears already filling her eyes. Maggie hadn't spoken publicly in years, not in front of a crowd, not even at school. Jack turned confused for a moment, then saw Hannah nod almost imperceptibly. A hush rippled through the room. Maggie took a breath. She looked at Sonny, then began to read. He walked through smoke with silent feet, and fire bowed beneath his stare. They called him Broken Lost. Not whole, but heroes. Wear their scars with care. Her voice was small, trembling but clear. He never asked to be the light, but carried it through ash and fear. Now we remember all he gave when no one else would see him. Near. Tears filled eyes across the room. Sonny looked at her tail, brushing the floor. Maggie folded the page and stepped down, cheeks flushed. And for the first time, she smiled. Evelyn Harper rose slowly from her seat, her gaze never leaving Sonny. "We've heard enough," she said. She turned to her colleagues, who nodded in light of the evidence. And in acknowledgement of public testimony, this committee will initiate a full federal review of the Canine Response Program with immediate suspension of all contracts under investigation. Applause thundered. Chairs scraped. Voices lifted. Jack lowered his head for a moment, overwhelmed. Then he turned to Sonny. "You did it," he whispered. Sonny pressed his head gently against Jack's leg, and in that moment a dog once branded unredeemable stood as proof that redemption is not granted. It's earned by those who walk through fire and emerge not unscarred, but shining. Cedar Hollow awoke to bird song and the slow warmth of spring light spilling across the hills. The rain had eased at last, and in its place came the golden hush of late morning, when the world breathes just a little softer. The clouds had scattered, revealing a sky the color of faded denim, and below it life stirred in a way that felt finally new. Nestled at the edge of town where forest met pasture, a red barn with white trim now stood freshly painted, flanked by a gravel path that wound past a wooden sign. The Golden Home Project. For every dog that was once forgotten. The project had taken shape faster than anyone could have predicted. In just 3 months, the efforts of Jack Renshaw, Thomas Grady, Hannah Lewis, and a small army of volunteers had transformed Jack's modest farm into a sanctuary, a place where broken dogs could find wholeness again, where those once labeled untrainable, unworthy could be reminded they were. Neither Jack now walked the grounds each morning, clipboard, in hand boots, muddy and eyes steady. He had always been a man of quiet resolve. But now there was something lighter in his step. He wore a flannel rolled to his elbows, the sun catching the copper in his dark blonde hair. He no longer looked like a man running from the past, but one building something new. At his side always walked Sonny. The golden retriever had become more than just a rescued soul. He had become the heart of the place. With his golden coat gleaming and his calm, steady eyes, he was both mentor and mascot. The newer dogs, some limping, some frightened, often followed his lead, trusting where they once resisted. Trainers said his presence alone seemed to ease tension, to remind the others that survival could give way to joy. One of those trainers was Thomas Grady. Grady had traded his firehouse jacket for a denim work shirt and worn leather gloves. His days were now spent building kennels, fixing fences, and slowly rebuilding what he had once lost when his former program collapsed. He spoke rarely about the past, but every so often his hand would rest on Sonny's head and he'd murmur, "You got us here, old boy." Inside the converted barn, Hannah Lewis managed the small community office, coordinating volunteers, fielding adoption inquiries, and making sure that food meds and dog beds were always accounted for. Her natural warmth and calm had made her the perfect anchor to the daily whirlwind. But it was Maggie who had made the place shine. Each time a new dog arrived, Maggie, now 10 taller and more confident in her quiet way, would greet them from a distance with her sketchbook tucked under one arm. She had a small corner studio in the barn, complete with a painting table, brushes and watercolors arranged in rainbow rows. From here, she created portraits of each dog, sometimes lifelike, sometimes wildly abstract, but always true to spirit. She called it her hope wall. Each framed drawing hung beside the dog's name and story. Some were pending adoption. Others, like Sunny, were permanent residents. Above it all, Maggie had painted a single phrase in block letters. Not broken, just becoming. On a warm April afternoon, the sanctuary hosted its first public open house. Dozens from the town came. Families, reporters, fellow rescuers, children played in the fenced meadow while dogs chased balls or napped in the shade. Jack stood near the main gate, greeting visitors with a smile that no longer felt like effort. Hannah bustled between booths, answering questions and guiding guests. Grady gave tours of the training paddock, explaining the facility's purpose. And Maggie. She stood beside her hope wall, hands clasped behind her back, allowing people to look but not touch the paintings. She didn't speak much, but when asked, she nodded and smiled. Just enough. One woman, a retired teacher named Carol, bent down and asked, "Did you draw this one?" gesturing to a scrappy beagle named Tater Tot. Maggie nodded. "He looks so happy," Maggie said softly. "He is now." It was the longest sentence she'd spoken to a stranger in years. Later that evening, after the last car had pulled away and twilight had begun painting the hills in lavender and gold, Jack sat on the porch steps, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. The air was filled with the low hum of crickets, the occasional bark, and the rustle of wind through tall grass. Beside him, Sunny rested, head held high, his eyes fixed on the field. Out there the dogs played, some older, some younger, all once discarded, now free. Maggie walked slowly among them, barefoot in the grass, her dress catching the breeze. One by one the dogs trailed her like a parade, drawn not by command but by quiet knowing. She stopped near the willow tree and turned back. Sunny lifted his head. She waved. He rose now, graying around the muzzle, but still dignified, and trotted toward her. Jack watched them disappear into the light. And in that moment he understood healing wasn't a single act. It was 1,000 small ones, a hand extended, a scar accepted, a name spoken with love. Sunny had once been abandoned. Now he led. He was no longer a victim of a cruel system. He was the beginning of something better. Sometimes God sends angels not with wings but with fur, not to soar above us but to walk beside us, quietly, faithfully, through fire, through fear, through healing. Sunny's journey was not just a story of rescue, but of redemption, of how even those the world casts aside can become vessels of grace. He did not speak, but he taught. He did not ask, but he gave. He reminded us that miracles don't always come in thunderclaps. They come in moments of silent trust, in the warmth of a second chance, in the eyes of a soul, once broken, now whole again. In our daily lives, we pass by those who carry invisible scars, people, animals, even ourselves. We forget that healing takes time, that love requires patience, that God often works through the smallest of kindnesses. So today, remember, your light matters, your voice matters, and your care, however quiet, can be someone else's miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment below and subscribe for more stories that bring light into the shadows. And if you believe in second chances, in silent strength, and in the grace God gives through the unlikely heroes among us, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and guide your heart